Guards rushed to the gates of Porton Down, Britain's most secure and secretive military research facility. A lone metal bucket sat outside the complex. The staff feared the worst. As men carefully approached it, they realized the object wasn't ticking. In fact, it appeared harmless, filled with nothing more than soil. To the scientists inside, this was worse than a bomb. Across the country, Margaret Thatcher took to the stage at a conference when another bucket showed up. This was a deliberate attack. A single gram of this soil was enough to take a life. There was only one place in the nation where it could have come from, Base X. But it couldn't be. No civilian had set foot on the island in over 40 years. Only a handful of people even knew of its existence. But with the buckets came a warning. Fix what you've done, or we'll bring your darkest secret into the light. Germany's secret weapon. As Hitler tightened his grip over Europe in the early years of the war, Winston Churchill and his cabinet could only watch in horror as one nation after another fell beneath the relentless march of the German blitzkrieg. The United Kingdom now stood alone, defying an enemy that not only seemed unstoppable, but also wielded the most devastating weapons and ruthless tactics the world had ever seen. Germany already knew how far it could push the limits of war. During World War I, the Kaiser's army had unleashed Yellow Cross shells against Allied forces. When these projectiles burst open, a heavy, poisonous mist drifted across the battlefields. Soldiers breathed it in, unaware of what they had been exposed to, until hours later, the symptoms began to set in. Chemical damage appeared all over their body, their lungs failing with every breath. It was the first use of mustard gas in history, a sinister innovation that, along with other German chemical weapons, would cost the lives of around 100,000 men and leave over 1 million more wounded by war's end. Still, Churchill and his war planners feared this past carnage was just a prelude. Even before the Führer had officially declared war on Europe, his scientists were already working day and night to develop a new arsenal of chemical weapons, creating toxins so lethal they could disable entire armies without a single bullet. Among the worst of these creations was the nerve agent Tauben. Upon release, Tauben vapor invades the body. Vision blurs, muscles twitch and collapse, the lungs seize up, and breathing becomes impossible. Without immediate treatment, the victim is gone within minutes. Hitler's war machine managed to stockpile 12,500 tons of this invisible threat, loading it into shells and bombs ready to rain across enemy cities. As if chemical warfare weren't terrifying enough, Nazi scientists were also branching out to bioweapons. Intelligence reports revealed that SS chief Heinrich Himmler had ordered secret research programs aiming to weaponize specific diseases, attempting to breed malaria-infected mosquitoes capable of surviving long enough to be unleashed upon enemy populations, igniting unstoppable pandemics that would crush their adversaries from within. Paranoia only increased after journalists began spreading rumors about German spies who had already conducted biological warfare tests in the London Underground and the Paris Metro, quietly contaminating sealed environments where gas masks would offer little protection. The British public, already fighting to survive amid air raids and food shortages, now faced the possibility of a new silent war where enemy strikes could spread unseen and creep their way through tunnels, marketplaces, and homes. Churchill knew that waiting for the Nazis to strike was not an option. There was only one solution to counter the menace: beat Hitler to the punch. Britain's new agent. Winston Churchill turned to Dr. Paul Fields, the director of the biology department at Porton Down, and assigned him to create a weapon so devastating it could bring the war to an end. Fields was no stranger to covert operations. He had already made a name for himself after his alleged connection with the plot to assassinate Reinhard Heydrich, a high-ranking SS officer and Holocaust architect who was so cruel and brutal to his victims that Hitler himself had named him, quote, the man with the iron heart. According to reports, Fields had provided special operations agents with modified grenades filled with botulinum neurotoxin. However, what Churchill was asking Fields wasn't about targeting one man. A biological weapon would not distinguish between soldiers or civilians, adults or children. Fields was being asked to create a weapon that had the potential to wipe out an entire nation, and he was determined to deliver it. After extensive research, he concluded that the most viable candidate was anthrax. Hardy, resilient, and terrifyingly effective, this bacterium had already been used during World War I by Nordic rebels working alongside German forces to infect Russian troops. In humans, skin exposure could result in lesions and swelling, but the real danger came when the spores were inhaled or ingested, leading to fever, nausea, shortness of breath, and in many cases, the loss of life. Field selected a particularly virulent strain, known as Volum 14578, provided by an Oxford bacteriologist. It was lethal not only because of its potency, but because it grew more contagious with each host it infected, making it ideal for mass deployment. However, Fields knew that even this carefully engineered bioweapon would be worthless unless it could survive real-world conditions. Before anthrax could be deployed over Germany, it needed to be tested. That posed a problem. Any test would also carry immense risk. The spores could spread, contaminate livestock, and infect civilians. To safely proceed, the British needed a location that was remote, contained, and far from the public eye. That's when Churchill thought of the perfect place. His friend, Molly Dunphy, had recently inherited a small, uninhabited island off the Scottish coast, just over a mile in length, sitting by the waters of Gruinard Bay. Rugged, isolated, and expendable. Perfect. The Island of Doom. The British government secured Gruinard Island for £500, promising its owners they could buy it back for the same price once the war ended and the land was deemed, in their words, quote, fit for habitation by man and beast. By 1942, the first boats began arriving from the mainland, their decks packed to the rails with live sheep. Dozens were ferried across the waters to the isolated patch of rock that had now been labeled Base X. Once ashore, agents dragged the sheep into a makeshift quarantine zone. Special wooden crates had been built to hold them, all facing the direction from which the anthrax would be released. To protect the agents from secondary infection after the tests, each crate was draped in heavy coverings, shielding the animals' fleece and leaving only their heads exposed to the toxic cloud. Among the small team on the island was Lieutenant Calderon Howe of the United States Navy, attached to Britain's Special Projects Division at Porton Down. Armed with a 16mm color film camera, Howe captured the operation. This footage would remain buried under classified seals for decades. In the surviving reels, one can see rows of sheep standing helpless, facing the threat coming their way as agents release the bomb. A dense mist, laced with millions of lethal anthrax spores, unfurls across the open field, slowly swallowing the animals in a brownish-gray cloud. Far beyond the shoreline, scattered residents on the mainland could glimpse what was happening across the bay. At the time, they had no idea they were witnessing a biological weapons test. Still, years later, some locals would even allege witnessing some of the sheep dropping lifeless to the ground as the mist went past them. Official reports later clarified that while some animals collapsed faster than others, the infection usually took about 3 days to fully take out the sheep. Once they were gone, agents moved in, performing autopsies to ensure the anthrax had worked as intended. The lifeless sheep were then incinerated. Yet, according to some accounts, not every carcass was properly disposed of, with some simply buried under thin layers of soil. The trials only kept expanding. Over time, different dispersal methods were tested, including aerial drops from aircraft, mimicking how biological weapons might be deployed in a real-world attack. In total, 22 anthrax bombs were detonated on Gruinard, releasing an estimated 300 trillion anthrax spores into the fields. The results were consistent. No matter the method, the outcome was the same. Within days, every exposed sheep had lost its life. The experiment was a complete success. Anthrax had proven it could survive explosion, aerosolization, exposure, and still annihilate its targets with merciless efficiency. Britain had its weapon. A lethal bite. But just as Britain prepared to unleash its anthrax arsenal over Germany, concerns began to surface. Detonating biological weapons over enemy territory carried a risk no one could fully contain. A direct hit on Germany's heartland might succeed, but if the spores spread freely, the consequences could spiral across borders, contaminating not only German soil, but drifting into neutral countries, or worse, back to Britain itself. To avoid turning all of Europe into a biological hazard, the plan had to be redrawn, and Operation Vegetarian was born. The new mission abandoned explosive delivery altogether. Instead, Britain would disperse linseed press cakes laced with anthrax spores across Germany. These infected cakes would rain down over farmlands, where cattle would eat them, introducing anthrax into the livestock population. Infected meat would then move through Germany's food chain like a saboteur. By the time the Führer realized what was happening, it would be too late. His soldiers would be gravely ill, his people collapsing, and the source of the plague would remain invisible. But this new strategy came with its own challenges, leaving British strategists looking for ways to deliver a fragile, non-explosive payload over hundreds of square miles and ensure it landed intact and edible for cattle. To solve this, Britain began modifying its Royal Air Force bombers, specifically the Avro Lancaster, Handley Page Halifax, and Short Stirling. Engineers designed a custom wooden tray system, each capable of holding hundreds of cakes. The trays were mounted in the aircraft's flare chutes, which were typically used for signal flares or propaganda leaflets. When deployed, the trays would release gently, allowing the cakes to flutter down over German pastures, spreading evenly without breaking apart on impact. Dr. Paul Fields and his team estimated that each aircraft could drop hundreds of trays in a single flight, spreading across 60 miles of land in under 18 minutes. With the delivery system solved, mass production began. A cake company based in Blackburn Meadows was contracted to manufacture the linseed cakes, which were then injected one by one with anthrax spores by a specialized team. At peak capacity, 250,000 cakes were produced per week, resulting in over 5 million infected cakes by spring 1943. Everything was in place. All that remained was Churchill's green light to launch what would become the most devastating biological strike in history. But then the war turned. As the Allies landed on the beaches of Normandy in Operation Overlord, Germany's days appeared numbered. The need for a biological campaign diminished. With Allied troops marching across Europe, preparing to take Hitler's empire apart from within, Operation Vegetarian suddenly seemed obsolete. Had the mission gone forward, not only would Germany's cattle and citizens have suffered, but its soil would have been poisoned with anthrax spores, capable of surviving for nearly a century, turning the nation's farmlands into biological minefields for generations. But the mission was scrapped, and the stockpile of infected cakes was quietly incinerated. Underground trials. Britain's bioweapons experimentation didn't end with Operation Vegetarian. Long after the war, the threat of biological warfare still haunted British officials. By the early 1950s, with the Cold War intensifying and fears of unconventional attacks growing, high-level discussions began about whether the nation's cities were prepared for a biological strike. Paranoia kept growing. The notion of a pathogen released during rush hour on a place like the London Underground was too haunting to ignore. Agents needed to know if they had a chance to fight against something like this. By the summer of 1963, a supervisor boarded a moving London Underground train traveling between Collier's Wood and Tooting Broadway. As the train sped through the tunnels, the man opened a window and released a small tin of fine powder laced with the bacterium Bacillus globigii. Over the next 12 days, London transport workers, under discreet orders, began collecting samples through the underground network. These were quietly sent to the Ministry of Defense, where scientists at Porton Down analyzed the results. What they found was deeply unsettling. According to the final report, quote, bacterial spores can be carried for several miles in the tube system, and trains traveling through an aerosol become heavily contaminated internally. Fortunately, the bacterium used for the tests posed no known danger to humans. This had only been a test to understand the vulnerability of public transport to a bioterrorist attack. However, this was not the only experiment British officials carried out. Other secret reports, some still partially classified, hinted similar covert trials conducted across Britain's infrastructure, and there's no information about what bacteria were used in those trials. Whispers emerged of tests carried out on British railway networks, the London Post Office cable tunnels, and even within the underground citadel of government buildings. What little is known suggests that these experiments failed to produce any effective countermeasures. Britain had uncovered its weakness, but had found no way to defend against it. By late 1963, some scientists suggested further escalating the experiments. Bacillus globigii was too mild, and the tests called for the release of bacteria that more closely resembled the pathogens the enemy might deploy. However, there's no public record of whether such trials were ever approved or carried out. Uncovering the truth. As decades passed, and the Biological Weapons Convention of 1972 pushed nations to abandon the development of weapons too dangerous to control, Britain hoped its dark experiments would fade into history. But on the shores near Base X, the past was coming back to haunt them. Farmers along the Scottish mainland began reporting that livestock were falling ill without explanation. Some speculated that the trouble began after a sheep carcass washed ashore, carried in from the island. When they raised the issue with the authorities, compensation arrived swiftly. Too swiftly. Locals quickly pieced it together. As one resident later recalled, quote, "It was quite obvious to us that they knew something about it, or they wouldn't have paid up as quickly as they did." Journalists soon began to arrive, trying to reveal the wartime secrets long buried by government seals. They knew the island had been used for military research and that no one was allowed to set foot there. Even decades after the anthrax bombs had stopped detonating on Base X Island, the land remained dangerously contaminated. Every time government scientists returned to test the soil, they found lethal levels of anthrax spores still clinging to it. Some estimated that the place would remain like this until 2050. Rumors swirled among the public. The government offered no official explanation. Then, in 1981, an obscure environmental activist group, calling itself Operation Dark Harvest, took matters into its own hands. They breached the island's quarantine, dug into its infected ground, and extracted buckets of anthrax-laced soil. Shortly after, outside the gates of Porton Down, the very place where Dr. Paul Fields had conceived the anthrax tests on Base X, officials discovered one of those buckets. The message was clear. Decontaminate the island, where the infected soil would be unleashed, quote, "at appropriate points that will ensure the rapid loss of indifference to the government and the equally rapid education of the general public." The Ministry of Defense had no choice. They would have to return to Base X. Decontamination. In the mid-1980s, over 4 decades after the anthrax experiments had concluded on Base X, British agents arrived back on Gruinard Island for one final mission. To eradicate every last spore of the resilient pathogens scattered across the land, over 280 tons of formaldehyde, diluted in seawater, were drenched across the island's surface, seeping deep into the soil where anthrax spores had been buried and preserved. The chemical flood scorched the land and bled into the surrounding ocean, poisoning the waters and taking out some of the local sea life. The topsoil from the most contaminated zones had to be physically excavated and removed from the island. To this day, the final destination of that soil remains a mystery. Once the land had been treated and stripped, the next step was a test of survival. The island's first residents since the wartime trials arrived, a new flock of sheep. However, this time, they were not sent to their doom, but rather to act as monitors, grazing the pasture for years under surveillance. When scientists finally returned, they found them alive, healthy, and breeding. On April 24, 1990, the British government finally declared Gruinard Island safe. But while the anthrax was gone, the legacy of Base X remained. Long after the danger has supposedly passed, legends persist. Some claim the island was never fully decontaminated. Others whisper that rebel groups have returned to it, harvesting its still infected soil for dangerous purposes. According to one unconfirmed story, at one point, Scottish extremists came down to the island, collected a sample of the soil, and delivered it to Osama bin Laden. Whether these stories are true or myth, one thing remains true. Few dare to set foot on Gruinard Island today.